Hi, today we're going to take a look at the new WebLogic Maven plugin in WebLogic Server 12.1.2. To get started with, I've downloaded the JDK and WebLogic Server. So first let's install the JDK. And let's add that to our path. And we'll just update our profile and we should now have the right Java. Okay, so let's install WebLogic Server. Java jar, and so this will start up the WebLogic Server installer. And we'll go ahead and install WebLogic Server. Okay, we won't launch the configuration wizard just yet. We'll do that later on. Okay, so we've installed WebLogic Server. Now, a couple of things to take a look at. Now, we already have Maven installed, but if you don't, there is a copy of Maven inside the Oracle Common modules directory. So if you want, you can go ahead and use this version of Maven right here. As I said, we already have Maven installed, so we won't do that this time. The other thing to take note of is inside the Oracle Common directory here, there's a plugins Maven directory where we find a bunch of files that describe various components that we have available in WebLogic Server that Maven can use. And the first one we're going to look at is this Maven sync plugin here. So the sync plugin allows you to take a set of artifacts from your Oracle home, like the one we've just installed, and populate your Maven repository with those artifacts. That can be either your local Maven repository in your home.m2 directory, or it can be a shared Maven repository that you might have, for example, using software like Archiver or Artifactory or Nexus. So the sync plugin provides a mechanism to populate your Maven repository with all of the dependencies that you need to use Maven with Fusion middleware products, including WebLogic, Coherence, ADF, and so on. It also allows you to update your repository if you apply one-off patches to an Oracle home, which, as you know, in the Oracle way of doing things, may not in fact change the version number of a jar file, which is slightly different from the way that Maven normally works, in that it expects the version numbers to be incremented every time an artifact is changed. So that's the reason we have the sync plugin, firstly to help you populate your Maven repository, and secondly to handle the case when you have applied patches to an Oracle home and you need to update your Maven repository. So let's go ahead and install the Oracle Maven Sync plugin into our local repository. So it's sitting here inside this directory, Oracle Common Plugins, Maven, Oracle Maven Sync 12.1.2, and we can install it using the Maven install file goal. So we just need to tell it the file that we want to install, which is this jar file here, and the POM file to use. Which is this one right here, Oracle Maven Sync. Okay, so that's going to actually install the Maven Sync plugin into our local Maven repository. So let's go and take a look and see what happened. So our local Maven repository, of course, is in our home directory in the .m2 directory under repository, and if we look under here now, we'll have a Oracle Maven directory. Here's the Oracle Maven Sync plugin that we just installed, and we can see it's sitting there ready to use. So let's use the Maven help describe goal to see what we can do with the Maven Sync plugin. So we just need to tell it the group ID of the plugin we're interested in, which is Oracle Maven, and the artifact ID, which is Oracle Maven Sync. And this will give us some information about what we can do with that plugin. So let me make this window a little larger here. Okay, so we can see the plugin has two goals. It has a help goal and it has a push goal, which we can use to populate a Maven repository. So let's just run that command again with the detail. So we see, for example, here the push goal has these parameters here, whether or not to fail if there's an error, where the Oracle home is, where the local repository is if we're not using the default location. The server ID allows us to specify a remote Maven repository, something like an Artifactory or Nexus repository, and the test only parameter allows us to see what would happen without actually doing anything. So what we want to do now is populate our repository with the various artifacts included in WebLogic server. So just before we start, we'll just take note that currently all we have under Oracle is just our just the Maven Sync plugin that we just installed. Okay, so let's populate our repository. So to do this, we're going to run the Oracle Maven Sync plugin, Oracle Maven Sync, and we're going to execute the push goal. So first we need to tell it where our Oracle home is. So we do that by specifying the Oracle Maven Sync Oracle home parameter, and in this case it is in WLS home, and we can also say, for example, Oracle Maven Sync fail on error equals true or false. We'll say false for argument's sake. And we could also specify the repository to use if we're not using the default one. But here we are using the default location, so let's just go ahead and run this and see what happens. Okay, so what we can see now is it's just downloading a few dependencies from Maven Central that it needs to execute the plugin, and now the Oracle Maven Sync plugin is running, and it is actually going and finding all of the artifacts inside the WebLogic home that we just created and populating our Maven repository with those. So if we take another look now in our Maven repository under com Oracle, we'll see we now have quite a lot of things in here. So we have some coherence things, we have some Eclipse links, top link, and a bunch of WebLogic artifacts. So all of the artifacts provided by WebLogic server have been loaded up into our repository and available for us to use now. So some of those artifacts are actually Maven archetypes. So let's take a quick look at those. So if we take a look under com Oracle WebLogic archetype, we see we have 4 archetypes. One is for a basic message-driven bean project. The second is for a basic web application. The third is for a basic web application with EJBs. And the final one is for a basic web service project. This other thing we see here, WLS common, is a parent POM that is shared by the other 4. So that's provided as a mechanism for you to add some site-specific customizations. So for example, if you had a test server that you always use to deploy your applications and test them, you could put the details into this common POM, and that would automatically make it available in all of the archetype, all of the projects you create from the archetypes. So we'll see how that works a little later on. So for now, let's go ahead and create a basic web app. So I'm going to make a new directory, and we're going to use the Maven archetype generate goal, which allows us to create a project from a Maven archetype. So we need to give it a few parameters. So first we need to tell it about the archetype we want. So the archetype we want to use in this case has the group ID. Sorry, put in here archetype group ID equals com Oracle WebLogic archetype. The archetype artifact ID is basic web app. The archetype version is 12.1.2-0-0. And now we need to tell it about the project that we want to create. So for our project, we want the group ID to be com.redstack. We want the artifact ID to be my basic web app. We want the version to be 1.0 snapshot. Oops. And we can also tell it that the archetype repository that we want to use is the local repository. That'll just save us from waiting while it searches through Maven Central for all of the archetypes there. Make things a little bit faster. Okay, so let's issue that command. And we see it's just asking us to confirm those details, so we hit enter, and now it's created this my basic web app project for us. So let's go in there and take a look. Okay, so we can see it's created the standard Maven directory structure with source main Java, source main web app. It's created a Maven POM file for us. We have a Java bean here. We have some HTML pages and CSS and so on. So let's take a look at the POM file and see what we have here. Okay, so you can see here the details that we specified that describe our project. You can see here it's pointing to a parent POM. This is what we talked about earlier, so the WLS common parent POM. So by doing that, we are inheriting any settings from that POM. As it's shipped out of the box, there aren't in fact any, but as I said, you can go and put site-specific customizations in there, and by virtue of having this parent tag in here, those will become available to any project you create archetypes. Next, we see there's a dependency on the Java web API, because this is a web application, and then we can see some extra information here telling the Maven compiler plugin that we want to use Java 1.6 to compile this, and the versions of the various other plugins that we want to use, the war plugin and so on. Now here we have the configuration section for the WebLogic Maven plugin. So we're going to use the WebLogic Maven plugin to compile, package and deploy our application. So we'll come back and take a closer look at this a little bit later on. For now, let's just go ahead and do the compile. Okay, so again you can see Maven is pulling down a few dependencies that it needs from Maven Central, and then it has gone ahead and compiled our project for us. So if we take a look now, we'll see the target directory has been created and we see our compiled class file in here. Now let's package our project. Okay, so we can see if we look in here, that's run the Maven compile again. It's run the Maven war plugin to create a war file and place that in our target directory. So if we take a look now, we will see that we do have a war file sitting here in our target directory, and we can take a look to see what's in that. And we see it basically contains the compiled classes or class, our WebXML deployment descriptor, and our HTML and CSS resources. Okay, so we're ready to go ahead and deploy that now. So let's take a moment and actually create a WebLogic server that we can deploy that on. Okay, so if we jump into our WebLogic server that we just installed earlier, and we'll run the domain configuration wizard to create a new domain. It's going to take the default options here. I'm going to give it a password, welcome1. And we'll create the WebLogic domain. Okay, that's all done. So let's go and start our WebLogic server up. Just tidy up our windows here so we can see the server is in running mode. Let's open up a console. So there's going to be localhost 7001. And we can see here that there are currently no applications installed, obviously because this is a brand new server. So let's install our application using Maven. So first of all, we need to go into the POM file and tell Maven where our server is. So here we have again the configuration for the WebLogic Maven plugin. So here we're telling it that during the pre-integration test phase of the Maven build, we want to execute the deploy goal in the WebLogic Maven plugin, which will deploy an enterprise application to WebLogic server. And we need to give it the admin URL, the user, and the password. The source is already set to point to the WAR file that we just created, and the target server we can set. We only have an admin server in this case, but we could change that to point to a different server or indeed to a cluster if we wanted to. So let's go ahead and specify the details in here. These $ bracket things that you see here are variables that point back to the common parent POM that we spoke about earlier. So if you had gone to that parent POM and defined a Oracle username, Oracle password, those would automatically get picked up in here by the default POM that's created. So in this case, we're just going to go ahead and type the details in directly. Okay. So now let's go ahead and run Maven and tell it to run up to the pre-integration test phase. So again, it is going to check if it needs to compile and repackage our application, and then it will go ahead and download any extra dependencies that it needs. So you can see now it's just checking if any of the WebLogic dependencies have got updates available, which they won't have, and then it's going to deploy our application to the WebLogic server. This check that you see happening now by default will happen the first time each day that you use the WebLogic Maven plugin, and there's a setting in your Maven settings file that you can use to check more or less often, or to indeed never or always check for updates if you're so inclined. This automatic checking means that you, if you do apply any one-off patches and rerun the sync plugin, that those will get picked up automatically at worst case, the following day. If you run Maven with the -u option on the end, it will actually update all the dependencies immediately. So after you apply patches, you should use the -u option to make sure you pick up the latest versions. Right, so we can see that has now deployed to the admin server. If we go back over to our console and take a look, we can see our web application is here now. And let's go ahead and take a look. We can see where we can access the application here, and here it is. So we can go ahead and play with that. And that's basically the extent of that example application that we have. So you can see it's relatively quick and easy to create an application from an archetype, and to get that building, packaging, and deploying to a WebLogic server instance. But let's see what else we can do with the WebLogic Maven plugin. So we're going to use the Maven help describe goal again, and this time we're going to ask it to tell us about the WebLogic Maven plugin. So it has the group ID of com Oracle WebLogic, and the artifact ID is WebLogic Maven plugin. Might help if I spell Maven correctly. Okay. So let me just scroll back up here so we can see this. So we can see here the plugin supports 19 goals. So we've already seen a couple of these, but let's go through and see what else we can do. So there's an appc goal that will allow us to use the appc compiler to precompile JSPs, for example, in a web application. There's a goal that will allow us to create a basic domain for just using the standard WLS template. And as you notice, it says here for more complex domains we should use WLST, which is standard anyway. is the deploy goal that we just used that allows us to deploy jars, wars, EAR files, resource archives, and so on. There's also a distribute app goal, which allows us to distribute our application to all of the nodes in a cluster and have them sitting there ready for deployment or activation. There's a help goal that just gives us help information, which is pretty much what we're looking at now. We have an install goal that will allow us to install WebLogic Server either from the zip installer or the jar installer sitting in a file in our file system, or from an installer sitting inside a Maven repository. So, you know, that goal would be useful if we wanted to build a more complex or automated test where we actually install WebLogic Server, create a domain, maybe we run a bunch of WLST scripts to set up some data sources or queues or whatever it might be, then build and deploy some applications, run some automated tests, and then shut down that environment. A few other ones we have here: we can list the applications that are running on a server or a cluster. We can start an application and stop an application. Similar to deploy, there is a redeploy, which allows us obviously to redeploy an application. We have a start server and a stop server, which will allow us to start or stop either the admin server or managed servers. We have an undeploy goal, which will remove an application from a server or a cluster. We have an uninstall goal, which will uninstall WebLogic Server. We have update app, which will allow you to update an application using a deployment plan. There's a WLST goal that will allow you to execute a WLST script, either online or offline. And then we have some web services goals. So we have a goal to generate a client. We have a goal to compile JAX WS web service, generate the source code, and the other artifacts that you need, and also a WSDLC compile goal that will generate from a WSDL file, will generate a partial Java implementation of a web service. So you can see there's quite a few other goals available here in the WebLogic Server plugin, and we'll see how to use some of those in the next video. Thanks for joining us today. Goodbye.